The Biden administration's stated goal for this latest government boondoggle is to utilize taxpayer funding to strategically deploy electric vehicle charging stations across America. Not only is such an endeavor not the federal government's responsibility, this program doesn't work, won't work, and will end up wasting massive amounts of federal money. You need no further evidence than Secretary Granholm's recent experience of trying to take an electric vehicle out for a spin, a trip that ended in disaster and confirmed that EVs are overpriced, unreliable, and infeasible without massive federal subsidies. Mr. Chairman, the Biden administration, through this policy and others that were buried in the so-called Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is attempting to use taxpayer money to implement the Green New Deal, a pie-in-the-sky idea that is not only destined to fail, but will waste massive amounts of money and further impoverish American citizens. The Biden administration is pursuing such boondoggles despite the fact that we are already facing out-of-control inflation, increasing energy costs, and bone-crushing grocery bills, all because of Bidenomics, all because this administration is economically illiterate and obsessed with furthering the agenda of the UN and the World Economic Forum. My fellow Wyoming citizens and Americans as a whole are more concerned with the prospects of heating their homes, putting food on the table, and taking care of their families. Yet what is the Biden administration focused on? Banning the internal combustion engine and forcing everyone into electric vehicles that won't work effectively in the vast majority of the country. My amendment is designed to stop the Biden administration from continuing its wasteful and profligate spending on projects that do not provide a benefit to the American public. I urge my fellow members to support this amendment, and with that I reserve.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves. And for what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition, and I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Mrs. Dingell.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise with a great deal of respect for my colleague, but in opposition to this amendment, which seeks to cut funding from the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. Here is the reality. The world is moving to alternative transportation. It's not all going to be electric vehicles. It could be hydrogen. It will be other. But right now, electric vehicles are the future of transportation in this country and in the world. And we are competing in a global marketplace. As we continue to invest in this EV transition, it is critical that we get the charging infrastructure right. We must do everything within our power to keep America competitive, to make it easier for consumers to make this transition, and that's what this program does. It plays a vital role in expanding our charging infrastructure, alleviating fears, and creating an interconnected network that everybody has access to, not just those that have access to expensive chargers. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program provides funding to states to deploy EV charging infrastructure and establishes networks that make them more accessible. We must work together to expand EV charging accessibility and invest in American-made EV chargers. We must support and advance their development, their production and distribution, and the infrastructure nationwide. To meet these goals, we've got to get serious. We got to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And defunding these programs is not how we should be legislating. To ensure that we have a competitive future, that we are competing in a global marketplace with other countries and their manufacturers, I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Rather than supporting our domestic energy production and investing in much-needed roadway infrastructure projects, the Biden administration has opted to continue skewing the definition of infrastructure to pursue its electric vehicle and renewable energy subsidy programs. The Biden administration, in other words, continues to do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party and the richest among us who can afford electric vehicles while leaving everyday Americans behind. Let me be clear. This technology that DOT is pursuing and implementing has a track record chock full of failure, particularly within my state, as the freezing temperatures wreak havoc on batteries while also severely limiting the range of these vehicles. We have story after story of electric vehicles being limited to less than 100 miles in range as they are driven over our high mountain passes in freezing temperatures. This effort to force everyone into electric vehicles is thus not only wrong-headed and not within the purview of DOT, but downright dangerous. It is also important to note that under this program, state recipients are expected to construct vehicle charging stations within 50 miles of each other on major highways. This requirement alone is not feasible when confronted with the reality of Wyoming's vast rural terrain and wide open spaces. There are 80,000 vehicles a day that drive across I-80 in Wyoming. I-80 is the most important commercial transportation link from the east to the west coast, and in Wyoming it varies in elevation from 4,000 feet to 8,000 feet. Electric passenger cars and electric 18-wheelers are simply not feasible in Wyoming. I urge adoption of my amendment, and with that I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from
I yield
Illinois.
back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Let me be clear, this is yet another attempt by the Biden administration to force us to transition to an electric future, whatever that may mean. It can only do so if it uses our money to artificially prop up the electric vehicle industry that could otherwise never survive in a free market system, at least not in its current phase. Mr. Chairman, it is past time for this administration to halt its wasteful allocation of billions of hard-earned taxpayer money on the infrastructure that is destined to fail. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. It is the opinion of the chair that the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Illinois.
I demand a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wyoming will be postponed.